This is a 2-hour lecture. There's a lot of material to cover. And I thought maybe we can do this in 2 parts, 50 minutes, then take a 10-minute break, and then cover the rest. We'll see how it goes. So since I'm covering a lot of stuff today, the idea is to actually give you a sense of appreciation for what deep RL has become now, get you entertained, and probably you'll be confused as well. But hopefully some of you will get excited to study more of this. So this is the plan for today. We'll go through some history briefly. I'll explain RL and deep RL in a nutshell. And I'll mention some of the deep RL methods that are in use, standard sort of thing, and some of the challenges in the field. So just to kick things off, thought we'll look at this simple video here. Yeah, so here's a person trying to train a robot to flip pancakes. So of course, the human here is providing experience to this robot, and the robot has to use that experience to kind of bootstrap to a good policy of flipping pancakes. And to start with, it makes a lot of errors, but eventually RL allows it to do the job, solve the task. So 5 trials, not really. Some more demonstrations will happen, I think, but after a few trials, the thing will start flipping as required. It could play ping pong, I guess, with that policy. Here, this is just analysis of the final policy here, which has learned how to flip, and they're analyzing it using motion sensing, just for showing how things are moving. So that's just to kick things off. So now, just for a brief history, deep RL is actually not new. The idea of using neural networks for control is quite old. So the first few works I can think of came from the 80s. In fact, in this book, talk about applying neural networks for control problems. Well, I'm sure there has been work before as well. There was a nice thesis in the 90s, RL for robots, which actually covers a lot of the interesting innovations that we've seen that allowed neural networks to come to where they are right now in terms of solving control problems, exhibited a few years ago on the Atari domain. For example, experience replay. I'll talk a little bit about it later. Also covering the idea of using demonstrations for data efficiency, which is a very hot topic, and I'll cover that as well. It talks about hierarchical learning to reuse skills to make learning faster from past skills, reuse them to get better at tasks in the future. And then in the 90s came this breakthrough of RL used for the game of backgammon. This showed that RL was a valid approach, using neural networks together with RL was a valid approach, and it showed that a backgammon agent could beat proficient humans in this game. Then there was some work that came from Stanford, early 2000s, using model-based ideas within the RL framework. Meanwhile, deep learning matured a bit, hardware got better, and RL theory advanced as well. And come 2013, this happened. And following that, we know that RL was used to train a neural network that actually outperformed the world champion at Go. just last year. And also RL has been taken to more wilder problems, more real-world problems, mostly robots, but also some works going on in the domain of data centers for energy efficiency, controlling the cooling apparatus. So to solve those kinds of problems, the problems need to be RL friendly. And some of the characteristics of the problem that make them RL friendly are these. You can think of these problems as sequential decision-making problems, just like games are, where you have to make moves over time and you get feedback somewhere down the road in the future. So there's some dynamics in the system. There's uncertainty in the sense there's stochasticity in the environment. If there's an opponent and you don't know how they play, there could be some opponents. There's a variety of opponents, so there's a lot of ways that the opponent could behave. There's uncharted territory. There are paths in this game tree, for example, that you can construct that an agent may have never experienced before, or we ourselves may never have experienced before, so we might want to explore those paths to see what the value is for those paths. There are delayed consequences to every move, and so this kind of problem requires a strategy or a policy to solve. So one of the ways to solve this is through the RL framework, where we want to build an agent which has the capacity to learn or plan and act to find a strategy for solving the problem. So the agent has to be autonomous to some extent, should be able to explore a bit, probe the environment and learn from feedback, focus on a long-term objective, and there's a trade-off between exploration to get new knowledge and exploitation of that knowledge to actually play the game better. So most of you know this stuff, so I'll move on, but I'll just mention something about the game here because it will show up later on during some, when I show some examples of methods that are currently being explored. So this is just a very infamous game from Atari. I don't know, how many have come across this game? 3 people. Yes, this is a very hard exploration challenge. It's called Montezuma's Revenge. The idea is that this character there with the hat, it's called Pedro, or also called Panama Joe. I don't know why. I guess there's some history there. But that agent has to, that character has to move around the room here, collect the key that you see there, avoiding some obstacles, then go to a door and open it. And there are many such rooms. This is rooms inside some kind of Aztec temple. And this is a very hard exploration challenge. So most of what this character does, if an agent is given to control it, is that it dies. It just moves around, doesn't know what to do. There's very delayed feedback. The key comes from, if you can make 100 or so moves to the key, that's when you get the key. And to get to that key, to do those 100 moves, you need to kind of have some feedback along the way, but there is no feedback up to the key. And there's a very, very low probability that you can make to that key randomly. So this is a very hard challenge and comes up in a lot of papers nowadays. So RL, we all know, is a way to learn a strategy for the agent. You can learn a value function for a state or an action in a state. You can learn a policy directly, which in this case, pi or q. You could also learn a value function for the state, which is v. You could also learn a model for the agent, which is the model of the environment, which you can use to plan a bit ahead. And the agent always has a goal, which is to maximize the return, long-term reward. So just to get everyone in the terminology. So there is, this is a little fun toy problem. This cat has to come to home and it has an obstacle in the middle. So it has to find this path. It has to find the policy to get to that path. So there are many ways it can do it. If it knew the value of each action in the state, it could choose the best action. And that value is the long-term value. So what's the value for this action to get home? If it knew that, it would take that. It could also just learn a policy, which is what's the probability of selecting an action in a state, or it could be a deterministic policy. It could learn the dynamics model. In a sense, it could imagine a bit, if it goes down, it would meet this dog here, so it shouldn't really do that. So look ahead a bit. It gets immediate reward, and it has to maximize. It gets immediate at every step, or which is usually 0, or sometimes negative. It has to maximize the sum of these, usually a discounted sum, where the discounting takes care of how much the agent takes into account the horizon of the problem. What's the horizon? Would it favor short-term rewards over long-term? So we all know this, and we all know also that there are many RL methods which try to learn the value function, the policy, the model, and a lot of them fall under this view. If you look at this axis as the degree of sampling, how wide along a game tree you sample experience, or take into account the experience of alternatives in space. The depth here tells you something about how much you want to look ahead. So a lot of the RL machinery can be understood if you understand what kind of algorithm, where does the algorithm that you use falls in this little picture. So in general, in the end, it all comes down to estimating returns from samples of experience and using those returns to optimize the policy or the value function, or even learn the model. The heart of RL. So this is just a very quick example. Q-learning, you sample for one step and you bootstrap from the values in the next step. This is just a backup diagram for it. You are in a state, you take an action, the environment decides where you end up, and in that state you learn from a guess of the best move in that next state. So one step look ahead, and that's essentially Q-learning. And if you can go a long way down this path to get a better estimate of the return. If you go, the further longer you go, the more variance there is in these returns. Well, we all know that, I think. So, where does deep learning come in the picture? That is also not very hard to guess. It essentially impacts all classes of RL methods, whether they are value-based, policy-based, or a mixture of the two, which are actor-critic methods, as they're called, or if you're doing model-based learning. So deep neural networks can represent various aspects of this solution to the RL problem. But there's a deep neural network in the picture now, and so we have to take care of how we use the experience that the agent gets from exploration to train the neural network. How we manage the shift in the distribution as the agent interacts with the environment. What do we do about it? How do we sample from it? Do we sample from it, or do we just use that experience as it is provided by the agent to learn about the value or the policy that the agent should use in the future? Those things need to be taken care of when using deep neural networks for this problem. Well, just a brief sketch of the traditional way some robotics problems have been tackled. and they are still very useful ways. So robotics learning pipeline essentially goes from sensors to action through a series of steps. So usually come with a perception module, which does some vision and detection, and you might be interested in planning a bit, so you need a world model. Now model the physics of the problem. And then you can use that model to do some planning. And once you do some planning and see maybe this is a better action than this one, then you can send that to the controller, which actually executes the actions in the wild. But say you forget or you miss out some things in the perception model. There are some objects, say, in the environment that you didn't think were relevant, but they actually are. Now then this whole pipeline breaks down. There's a lot of information loss here, which only adds up. And it's a manual craft to do that. Of course, one can use deep neural networks for the entire pipeline, because we know that deep neural networks help get us good abstractions for the task at hand. The task here is decision making. So we could expect that deep neural networks would help us get good abstractions for decision making. And that's what a lot of the effort has been spent on in these past 5 to 6 years, where we see a lot of progress. Also thanks to compute. So I just want to mention another point here, that it's not that this top thing is no longer valid. It is still valid. And in fact, within deep RL itself, you could build various building blocks using deep networks and combine them in interesting ways. So there's a lot of work happening in that direction as well. But there's also another direction where the field is progressing, which is to push a lot of the algorithmic complexity inside a differentiable graph, which a deep neural network is already. So if you can basically instantiate your algorithm, which you have some mathematical equations and some logic, you can push that into the graph, which in a way that everything is differentiable. That is also a direction that the field is heading. I may cover one example of this. So that's, maybe you're also wondering, why do RL in this case? Why do deep RL when perhaps deep learning itself, just supervised learning, can do a lot? For example, here, this is a car which was given data for every single image around this limited domain, which is essentially just a track. That's just visual image as input, and there was a human driver, obviously. Who else would it be? Which drove around the path, and the steering angles were synchronized with all the images, and that data was used to train this for that limited domain. Now imagine it to scale to this scenario. I wouldn't think it would work. There is definitely something wrong with that, right? What about scenarios that we have never experienced before, or the agent has never experienced before? There's no data for that in the training set. So there, maybe it makes sense to create some sort of a simulator, use the data that we can collect, and instantiate that data maybe in that simulator, or use that data to bootstrap an agent to work inside a simulator, and use the simulator to also design a simulator with the data from the world, and then refine both together. So next, so in a way it makes sense to use RL for some aspects of real-world problems. Even if we have a lot of data, we may not have experienced enough situations in the wild. Of course, you could crowdsource a lot of the data. If there are cars out there which are tooled well, I guess Teslas are maybe, so there could be a lot of data that could be streamed back, and you can use it to get a better policy, but RL still has some uses there. So next I'll just mention briefly some algorithms that are kind of popular. Some actually are so old that they are not used in a practical sense, but they are mostly academic. You use them as baselines. So, which probably a lot of you know about. One is I kind of kick-started this field or gave a new breath to the field, which is DQN. Here, essentially, you have this agent that gets images and it tries to take actions in games. The goal here, obviously, is to maximize score in the game. And this is a value-based system where you're learning the Q function. But you can't just use Q learning as is. There's a deep neural network in the picture, so you have to use the data that you collect, experiential data that you collect, to train the neural network in clever ways. So there were some innovations needed to use that data in order to train these networks. So one of them was to use a buffer that keeps the recent historical experience and reuses it over and over. The agent samples that experience over and over from that buffer and creates batches for training the neural network in essentially a supervised way. This is needed because it makes the data more IID, and that is something that is needed for supervised learning. All the data is distributed roughly the same. Whereas if you just use experience that is collected online, then that distribution shifts over time. So you want to avoid that situation when training deep Q networks. Of course, there's also another thing that you're learning a guess from a guess, and that guess is coming from the deep neural network itself that you're training. So if you update that network, your guesses will also update. And so in order to not make the target, which comes from this guess, move so much, you freeze a copy of the network and sync it with the one that you're training over and over again. So that was needed to make the training work as well. Of course, if you are experimenting with DQN on small problems, you may not need this, but it usually helps. But this is, as I said, this is a pioneering method, but it's largely running out of fashion in some ways, but it showcases the value of deep RL. Significant improvements have been made since then. Of course, again, these are some of the innovations that followed from that I'll cover now, and they have been superseded as well, and we will come to those eventually. So in DQN, you're sampling experience from the replay buffer uniformly. So that turns out it works, obviously, but there's a better way to sample experience that would allow the neural network to also learn things that are hard. Focus more on the things that are hard. So if a sample, you've learned enough from it, you can't learn more from it. If you sample it again, it's no use. So maybe focus the attention towards samples that you make more error on. So that's what this essentially does, prioritized experience replay, where you sample experience based on the error that that sample brings to the learning. Another innovation. Now this is a cool idea from the point of view of using some of the RL theory and pushing it into the network architecture. as I mentioned, nowadays one of the directions is that you push a lot of the complexity of the algorithm into a differentiable graph. So this is one simple example of that, where, so a Q network, this is DQN, Q value is actually composed of two parts, a value of the state and the advantage of an action in a state. How good is an action compared to the average in a given state? So you could split this final layer into these two and then compose them to form a Q value. It's just a simple equation here. And you can train this network, and it showed to help in domains where, for example, in this game is called Enduro, a car racing game, and here, so for example, in this image, so the actions this thing can take is go left, right, or do nothing. So whatever it does, they're all the same. There's not much you can do. They have the same value. So no point in regressing over a Q value for all those actions. They would, no action is better than the other. So the advantage function would say that the values there are 0, right? So in such games where most of the actions are the same, but some actions become more relevant in certain situations, here, if it goes left, it would crash. So there, the advantage of going right is higher than going left. So this architecture takes into account such ideas. So it's basically an RL-informed neural network, and it's called dueling neural network. It's also very old now. But when you train all these things, and you train deep neural networks on supervised learning tasks, it takes a while. With RL, it takes even longer, because the feedback is really sparse in general. With supervised learning, you have labels for every sample. Here, there are no labels, really. You have to form a target through samples of experience where mostly you get nothing. So training gets even slower. So to address that, there have been some innovations in the throughput with which you could get data from, or experience from an environment. So here is an approach, also old now, superseded by new stuff, which essentially what it does is it uses one neural network which is shared across many environments. All those copies in these that are interacting with these different environments get experience from their version of their instance of the environment. Maybe I go to the next one to tell this better. So there's a shared set of parameters, a Q network. In this case, it's an actor-critic algorithm, which outputs both a value function and a policy. So shared parameters, there are many environments that you can instantiate. Each of them has a copy of these parameters. They play the game individually, and they take steps in their version, their instance of the environment. They compute gradients. They don't apply them there, but they send the gradients back to the shared parameter set. And the gradients are applied here in a lock-free manner, which is known as hog wild. And this worked. It actually worked so well that it reduced the training time, it halved the training time on Atari games. More than that, it actually also seemed to work on, say, if you run experiments with 3D environments, you have 3D environments, many copies of them. So there's a lot of different rendering times in each instance of the environment play a big role in slowing down things or speeding up things. So if the environment is being rendered slowly, then the experience from that environment would actually come later. But in this case, it doesn't matter, because here you are computing gradients in separate copies of the environments, and you're getting gradients. So if one is slow, it's okay. You still get gradients from others, and you will get the gradient from the slow ones at some point. So it showed value in 3D domains as well. But then it was still slow, half the time from DQN. That's like 4 days for one game. So, but yes, we could train even faster. This was work done here, right there. A student. Essentially, the student simplified the training process, still working with parallel copies of environments, but instead of interacting with them asynchronously, synchronized everything. So here's an agent running on a CPU or a GPU. It interacts with multiple environments in sync, takes an action in all of them, gets the next state and reward for the step from all of them, and then it uses this batched experience to do an update. As simple as that. What it turned out is that doing batched updates in this class of methods, which is policy gradient methods, more like actor-critic methods, was shown to provide more stable updates. It reduced training time further from 4 days to, say, a day, or even less, a few hours, and it performs just as well. Just some graphs for you. This is the parallel advantage actor-critic method. It is also called batched advantage actor-critic, or batched A2C. These are some of the, at the time, state-of-the-art methods, and across many games, roughly the same performance, but training time reduced significantly. But that still begs the question, can we go even faster? Can we increase throughput for data collection and learn from as much data as possible quickly? Something happened here. Hello? Okay. So now, this is recent work, which was motivated by both. So one more thing I would like to say about this work is that it actually helped iterate on research faster. So now you don't have to wait for 4 days to know if the idea you had 4 days ago worked. Now you have to wait for a few hours if you're running it on a complex domain like Atari or even bigger. Of course, you can run your ideas on simpler problems, and that is the recommended way to proceed with RL research. If it works there, then you can scale to bigger problems. But still, this helps scale your research a bit. So more effort has gone into this direction since then. For scaling research, making the iterations faster, but also driven by generalization of an agent to many tasks. And this has been driven by DeepMind. One of the works is called Impala, which translates to importance-weighted actor-learner architecture. I'll talk a bit about what that is. So we know, as I mentioned earlier, that A3C, the parallel asynchronous method, is good for 3D environments. It's also the case that it's very recurrent neural network friendly, which allows us to look at memory. But it was not very good with GPU use. Also, when you communicate gradients using A3C, if you scale A3C to many, many instances of the environment, say hundreds, then the gradients that you're getting from individual environments, they might be computed on a policy that is old, for a policy that is old. It's very stale because the policy that you are using, the current policy in the shared parameter space, it's actually fresh. You're not using that to get that experience or compute updates. So those updates can just be thrown away. Right? So communicating gradients which are stale is a bad idea. But we know that batching the experience is a good idea, which we, hello, something happened? Yeah, it's okay. So batching experience is a good idea, which we know from batched A2C or parallel POC. So DeepMind came up with a better architecture which allows us to work with 3D environments, use batched A2C kind of ideas in an interesting way. So here I will tell about that little in the next slide, but here these are just results from 2 games. One is a mushroom collection game, and another is a game where the agent has to go over platforms to collect some reward, but it cannot jump, so it has to plan. This is falling a bit. Anyway, so how does it do it? So this was the A3C, which had hog-wild updates. We want to get rid of those. And so now individual copies are not learning or not computing gradients. They're not communicating gradients. They are just acting and sending experience to a queue. And that queue is being sampled in batch to train an agent. They still each have a copy of the freshest parameters. But this algorithm, actor-critic methods essentially are on-policy methods. So you want the data to be from the policy that you actually have right now, and you update the policy as you go along. But since here you have many experiences coming, and these agents have a copy of a shared parameter set, which could have been updated while they are actually while they are collecting experience. So there's staleness of experience here. So to correct for that, you have to do some statistical, apply some statistical techniques like importance sampling to compute the gradients that are unbiased. So one thing I would like to mention here is the previous 4 or 5 things that I mentioned here. A lot of this is driven by hardware. So we want to use GPUs here because when you batch experience, that's when GPUs come in handy. But this field is moving very fast, even hardware for AI. So only time will tell how these architectures for training fare out on new hardware coming. And it is coming. So one other cool thing here is that since we have an agent here which is getting experience from multiple environments, not the gradients, just experiences, you could have different environments here. This is one game here, but you could have different tasks, and the agent can be interacting with many different kinds of environments. And so it would help the agent to actually come up with a policy that works on most of them, or all of them, or generalize better to even further tasks. This method could also scale to multiple GPUs. So this one is, these are parameters instantiated on, shared parameters on individual GPUs. Each one has multiple CPUs or processors or threads that collect experience for it, but they keep the gradients in sync. again, you could scale in a more interesting way, different tasks for each set of environments here, but you keep the gradients in sync. And this approach actually exhibits what is called positive transfer, which just means that in this case, if you train agents on individual games, expert agents, and you train agents on all games together, they know this approach shows that you can actually do better than expert agents if you train on many agents together. This is another way to parallelize, which is if you have a neural network that is too deep, way too deep than the standard deep RL neural networks, which are not very deep, to be honest. So here is one of the works that shows that you can actually use very, very deep neural networks. You can have parameters spread on GPUs, and you can, the parameters will always be synced, but then, yeah, you can learn from multiple copies of the environment or very deep neural networks. Just a quick slide showing that this method eats up data much, much faster than many others, but does not fall short in performance. There has been some more work on throughput, which has come out following this idea of batched experience collection and use, which was shown by batched A2C, which gave more stable updates. And now you can scale things to multiple actors or multiple GPUs, and now training time is reduced to minutes if you have many CPUs. You can still work with one GPU, but if you have many processors, you can still collect a lot of experience and get training done in minutes. So now we come to the current challenges in deep RL. There are many challenges out there actually to work on. These are some of the things that excite me, and so I follow a lot of research in these directions, and that's what I'll talk about. So the first one is on data efficiency or sample efficiency. So in these games or in any RL problem, say you have a simulator, you're interacting with the simulator. As I already mentioned, RL requires a lot of data. Deep RL especially requires a lot of data to make any progress because the rewards are really, really sparse. The methods that I talked about so far, so we've gone very far in throughput, getting a lot of data and using it, but we are still quite far away from using the data more efficiently. So it would be nice if you could just put an agent in the wild, and from very few samples of experience, it could get to some good level of performance instead of just having to just run loads and loads of trajectories and then try to come up with a policy. Also, live data, learning from real data is expensive. You don't really want to put an agent if it's an unsafe environment, for example. You want to learn to some level with some data that you have already, and then you may want to put it in the wild. So that brings us to one of the ways that you can make an agent more data efficient, and that is by actually bootstrapping it with old data that you may have already collected, some old control data that can be leveraged. And this is very common in real problems. So, for example, recommendation systems. There are some agents that are probably already deployed in some systems, and they are collecting basic agents maybe. They may not be using RL. They may be using some other methodologies. But they are there, and they are collecting data from these old policies, let's say, and that can be used to instantiate an RL agent, imitate those policies to some level of performance or close to them, and then build on it. So if we have such data, we can essentially imitate these old policies. And once we have imitated, we can actually use that bootstrapped agent in the environment itself, and hopefully it wouldn't crash. It would have some level, and it would keep learning from that point onwards. So this is some work that came out last year but published this year. Deep Q learning from demonstrations. Essentially, it is a DQN, but with an additional loss functions, which allow the neural network to also take into account old data. You basically learn from old data in a supervised way, and then once you are at some level of performance, so you learn a policy both from a supervised data set, which you have from the past, but you also try to maintain the Bellman relationship in your value function, in your neural network, so that your estimates between states as you move along a trajectory are not very miscalibrated. So use a combined loss in some ways in this approach. And it leads to not that behavior, but better behavior. In fact, at the time, I think it was the state of the art for these very, very hard exploration problems. Here, I've talked about this one, Montezuma's Revenge. Then that's called Pitfall there. This is a really, really hard environment, probably the hardest one in Atari games in the suit. You don't really see, there's just obstacles all over the place. Whatever you do, you die. Very, very sparse positive reward and very, very dense negative rewards. Up until this time, there was no previous approach that could move anywhere, even so any signs of life. But this one, demonstrations helped. Same for this approach. It's just a rescue operation, and this is also a hard one. It's higher scores than any published in the past at the time. This field is moving so fast that maybe in a couple of months, the things I'll talk about later down the slides will be old soon. So next. So one problem with that kind of demonstrations that I talked about here, where you have demonstrations in the game itself. So it's a very lab-like setup. You ask people to play the games for you, and you collect all the data, and then you can bootstrap on that. But maybe we don't want to set up this lab-like environment. Maybe we can just use data that is already out there somehow to instantiate a policy. So this work goes in that direction, where the idea was to look at YouTube videos for a particular game. In this case, it's again Montezuma's Revenge. And essentially embed all those videos, which are demonstrations of human behavior, into a space. Here it's visualized in lower dimensions, of course, such that similar states, here these are similar states moving in the same way, they are aligned and they're very close to each other. So this embedding was a key step to learn a common representation for this behavior in this game. So, how to learn this common representation? This is a bit involved here, but the main idea really is what they do is you have one video with many frames. You basically take, say, 2 frames separated by some time, which is the number of frames in the middle. That's the delta t. And you give these two to this network, which would then embed, make a feature representation down in the network. And you try to make the network predict or classify the delay between the frames. Here so if here the delay is 3, so it would classify, so this bucket is what this should be. So it's like a supervised signal for embedding the alignment between frames in this feature layer. They also do a similar thing with audio, which I will not go into details of, but eventually, once you have this embedding, now you can use this embedding to determine rewards. So here, essentially, you have the agent play the game, and it is at some frame, and that frame is, say, embedded in this space, phi, and you have demonstration data where you have also frames which are embedded in the space. Now you can compute the distance between these two using some cosine similarity, and the closer you are, the more reward you give to the agent. That means that the agent would learn more and more to imitate the behavior that is exhibited in the demo data, since it is embedded in this common representation. Yeah, so that's that. And they use this Impala training scheme, parallel training scheme for this purpose, for actually interacting with the environment with this reward that is generated by this match in this feature space. And again, it learns quite well. So essentially what they show is that this is the first method to convincingly exceed human level performance from demonstrations, or in general. At least in these games, most methods fail, so this one gets the best performance right now. In November 2018, I mean. So another way is to, this is a very, very, very recent work. It's on arXiv. Came out earlier, well, actually last week. So this is about using data that is already available out there, already deployed sensors, like in this case CC camera TV image or video, and extracting some signal from that image, instantiating those signals inside a simulator which is built on in Unity, and then letting the agent explore inside Unity. So this is unlabeled data. There's no labeling going on. This is just CCTV images. It is processed in a series of steps, calibrated using Google Maps, and then some detection using mask or CNN, and then some tracking going on using another module. And once you get the tracks, then you can basically put those tracks inside a simulated version of this scene, and it's possible to simulate static images better than dynamics. So here the simulations are essentially about the features that are static in the scene, and the tracks are dynamic, which we learn through this tracking process, and that can also be instantiated. And now we have expert trajectories in Unity, and Unity also gives some pseudo LiDAR kind of sensing data. So now you can use that data as observations or state and use the trajectories extracted from just video to kind of construct again a reward signal for an agent to actually behave like the demonstrated behavior. And that, yeah. So here it's kind of like a adversarial setup for generating rewards in this case. Here's expert trajectories, which are kind of pulled out from the wild. And now you have trajectories that may be generated by the agent interacting with the simulation. What this agent needs to do is it needs to match the behavior of the expert. So what's happening here is there's a discriminator which can discriminate between whether this input is from the expert or whether it is from the agent. If it fails to discriminate, that's good. That means that the agent should be rewarded. So that this determines the reward signal here. And so the agent, the more it can imitate better, the higher the reward, and so the better it learns to imitate. It's just a nice video from the group that did the work in Oxford. I'll let you read this actually. So they evaluated these behaviors that came out of the agent that was trained on behaviors that the expert trajectories exhibited, and the differences were evaluated through some interesting analysis that I don't have time to go through, but this came very close to the imitation, to the demonstration. So next up, I think I talked about this last year, but most of the students here are not from last year. So this is, but I keep it here because this is a really powerful idea. And it will be valid for a while, I think. Maybe for a long while, in different ways. So here the idea, in this case, is to give the agent some auxiliary tasks to perhaps learn a better representation for the deep network, which will help to behave well in the actual task. And the way this is done is to use the replay buffer more intelligently. So the key idea actually is that, in fact, I mean, this agent that is interacting in a game or in the wild or wherever, there's a lot of signal out there apart from the actual extrinsic reward. There's a lot of stuff going on. Can we use that stuff in the wild? Can we use the information present in the dynamics in the world or the images somehow to bring more reward for subtasks for an agent, which then, if it can solve those subtasks, then maybe it has learned some sub-skills that would be helpful in the bigger task. That's the general idea. So I said main idea here is to use the replay buffer here more wisely. And the way it's done is there are 3 separate things that they do with the replay buffer. And those 3 essentially are, one is to control the pixels, get a representation. So these all are sharing most of the representation of the actual agent. So build the representation further in this task, for example, such that the agent is able to make changes in the scene. So we train the agent on many tasks. Say for example, this is we'll take these cells. These cells represent a set of pixels on screen. So the reward here could be for the agent to maximally change the pixels. So the more pixels it can change with its behavior, the more reward it gets. So that's one task. And this is the same task for this cell, another for this cell. There's lots of such subtasks that are given to the agent. And now this agent has to essentially learn to control these pixels. That was the first one, and I already went through this. So I'll skip this slide. So what I'll say is there are about 400 extra reinforcement learning tasks that were constructed out of this subtasks for 400 cells, for example. Next was to actually predict short-term reward. So just use the replay buffer, which already has the rewards in there, states in there. So given a set of states, what is the actual reward, truth? So predict that. That helps with getting better features. The third task was to replay the value function. So this is an actor-critic method here. So in this case, only the critic is being trained over and over again. Critic is trained more often than the actor, which is learning online from real experience, as it is often done in actor-critic methods. So if you have a good value function, that means what? That means that you can evaluate the policy that you're following better. That means you can make the policy, optimize the policy. If you can evaluate it better, that means you can optimize it better. So if we can sample the replay buffer to make the value function better and better, that's an auxiliary task that helps as well to better the policy. So this at the time was shown to lead to 10x better performance in the sense of data efficiency. So it required 10 times less data to learn the same task as some other methods at the time. It's called Unreal here. Nothing unreal about it. Yeah. So that was actually an encouraging message, that this looking at the problem from another angle can help bring 10x performance gains. So imagine how many more 10x performance gains are to be gained. So this is just some video from the same method on multiple 3D tasks. Here the idea is to collect apples and lemons and melons, and avoid lemons. Yeah. There's many maze environments. It's very good at mazes. Laser tag as well. Yep. These videos actually make me sick a bit. Always have. But anyway, this stuff works. I'll move on to the next thing that is really, 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 really exciting from the point of data efficiency. This is something I'm also working on a daily basis. But this work comes out of DeepMind and Google Brain. So here, so far, all the methods that maybe some of you may have read this stuff, but most of the methods that you see within deep RL, within RL in general, that are commonly, say, applied, are value-based methods or policy-based methods which use the value function. And what's the value function? It's the function that tells you what's the expected value is of a state or an expected value of an action. It's the expectation. That's the key. It's the expectation, the mean value. But what if instead of the mean return, which is what it is, we look at the entire distribution of returns? We work in the space of distributions, not expectations. So this is what this work is about. Instead of Q, we'll have the whole distribution, which can be approximated in different ways. And I'll talk about a couple of ways. So why do this, you might ask, actually. I did. So there are a couple of reasons. So one is that, okay, so there are times when, say, you want to make an agent that takes into account some notion of risk. So say it's a very stochastic environment and you've learned a nice policy, but then say if you had access to this distribution, so say one action going right, say, would lead to could lead to a very high return, but it's really spread out. It's very risky. Another could be going left, and there the distribution is peaky. So it's a low reward, but it's quite certain that this is what you'll get. So maybe, depending on how you feel that the agent should be behaving, you could tailor that behavior to being more risk-taking or more risk-averse or safe. So that's a nice idea to think about. So that was the motivation, but it also leads to more data efficiency, which I'll talk about. Well, another thing is that, so if you're modeling distributions, you are not just modeling spread of returns, you can also model how their modality could be multimodal. But one thing I should also highlight is this is the spread or the uncertainty in the returns that we are modeling here is not the parametric or statistical uncertainty. It is the intrinsic uncertainty in the environment that is being modeled. It is the uncertainty that cannot be reduced. It is part and parcel of the environment. So the other kind of uncertainty, which also we'll talk about later, is the statistical uncertainty, and that reduces with the data. The more data you get, the more certain you get. This is not that. But anyway, it's a really simple change to DQN in terms of architecture. So here DQN, this is, so for any state, it would give you an action value for all the actions. One value, one Q value for each action. In this case, you're getting a return distribution for each action. The way it is done in this work, in this paper, is that the distributions are modeled as say, histograms. So you divide the space of returns, which is Z's here, from the minimum minimum return you could get in the environment and the maximum return you get in the environment. You form bins, and you are trying to get a probability, predict a probability for each of the bins. What's the probability of getting that return, that return, that return, that return for each of these actions? That's the main difference in the architecture. But then you also have to train that architecture, and then so there's a new Bellman operator for this that they came up with, an approximation to it. And that is, so if you remember, in Q-learning in general, we all know Q-learning here, mostly. We are sampling from one step, looking ahead one step. So you take the actual feedback in this step and the next guess for the best action. And put it together, that gives you the target, and you update your action value to that. That's the Q. But here you have distribution. So here you do a similar thing. You integrate. So of course, the next step is also discounted, depending on how you want to discount the returns. So you squeeze, the discounting squeezes this histogram here. Then you add this immediate reward to this. This shifts the histogram. And then you project this histogram onto the same support as predefined originally. And there you get the target. And now you have this new target that you want your action distribution to move to. And you can do this with cross-entropy loss. This is a simple classification problem, as is done in deep learning. It's like probability of belonging to one class or the other or the other or the other. So it's the same idea. And in fact, we know that cross-entropy loss actually behaves quite well for supervised learning. And one of the reasons that has been come out why this is very data efficient is because there's a lot of signal, lots of things to classify for the neural network, lots of things to learn from. And so it helps to come up with a better representation and speeds up learning. This is just a demo of how these distributions are. For each action, there's a different color. It can model a wide variety of distributions here. Yeah. So that's that. Some more nice videos from DeepMind. So here, this chicken, it actually, you can see from the distributions that it differentiates between actions better under pressure. Otherwise, it's all the same distribution. There's a lot one can learn from how your training is progressing when you use distributional RL as well. So that was that. And then came a big combination of a lot of the techniques I talked about. This is essentially this rainbow thing that you see here. It's also coming from DeepMind. I just tried to see if, okay, all the innovations that we've done in the past 2 years, what if we put all those together? Are they complementary? And yes, most of them are. So this thing involves distributional RL, the thing I just talked about. It involves dueling architecture for the neural networks, involves double DQN, which I did not talk about, but that's another very cool idea, very good idea. And prioritized experience replay all together, and significant performance boost in terms of data efficiency. So here in 44 million frames, it's surpassing the state of the art here, which in this case is the thing that I just talked about, distributional DQN. It goes beyond that. I recommend reading this work. So next comes a couple of other innovations, taking the distributional approach further. So the previous slides were talking about distributional approximation using histograms-like things, these histogram-like objects. But there was also a problem that once we are forming a target, this target could shift outside the actual support of the support that for the distribution that you've predefined. You define a minimum return, a maximum return, and you form bins. What if it goes outside? Or not even that. It actually even if it's staying within, you are moving, the target does not fall into the bins as is, it has to be projected back. And that approximation is not very nice mathematically to think about. So there is another way to do it, and it actually helps even more. And that is to, instead of now, it's kind of flipping the problem. So here we are learning, here we were learning probabilities for all the returns. Now we want to learn returns for a fixed set of probabilities. Yeah? So now the returns can go anywhere they want, but we fix the probability. For example, I want the return for the median. So what does that mean? The median means that half of the mass would lie on the left and half on the right. So where is that median? What's the value for that median? That's what you're looking for. It is predefined that we want, that means, whatever value you find, that just means that half of it would lie on the left and half on the right. So similarly, you can have more than median, you can have quantiles. In this case, say you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this essentially, this is the inverse PDF, or as you may know what that is. So if there are 5, this means 20% of the mass would lie under this probability, 40 would lie under this probability, so there'll be 20% mass within here, 60, 80, 100%. That's all what it is. And you want to find the return values that separate these masses. That's what's happening. So essentially you're trying to find the position of these z's given, say, a target that you also define in this quantile space. And you use a quantile loss and you get rid of the error and it works beautifully. And another idea, further idea, this is from this year, ICML. So here we are using the one that I just mentioned. We have fixed the quantiles, and we're trying to find the returns that fall for those quantiles. Now we are going to learn this quantile distribution implicitly. Remove another assumption or discretization. So here, it essentially is a very simple change from DQN to implicit quantile networks. What it is, so it's mostly the same, but there's an additional input here. It's a conditional distribution that you're learning. So here, we sample tau. Tau is like just a value between 0 and 1, uniformly sampled. That just defines what quantile you want. Say if it's 0.5, then that means you're looking for the median. And the output, this is basically integrated into this network. And so given, say, 0.5, you will get a value for all the actions. And now you can actually sample from this network. You give it a tau, as many taus as you want, and you get many values for each action. And you can use all those values and use the same loss that has been defined for this quantile loss to learn a representation and the implicit quantile distributions for each of the actions. Maybe it's a bit too much, but I would recommend looking at this paper. And also, I would recommend looking at the code, in fact, directly. Here, from dopamine, this is, okay, I did write dopamine, no, I did, yeah. So here, this is just some benchmark algorithms that some of the authors made public. where you can easily just go and play with them. And so, yeah, so IQN, I talked about rainbow, right? So it's competitive with rainbow. The green is rainbow, red is IQN. In some environments is worse, some is better. But what they saw is that it was better, or yeah, it was better than rainbow on the environments where we have yet not progressed beyond human level. I don't know what that really means, but yeah. Oh yeah, in this it's only 320 lines of code in Python, so maybe it could be even shorter if you use something else. I don't know. Yeah. So next challenge, I'm going to rush through a lot of stuff now. The data efficiency is one of the key things that I work on daily, so that's the most interesting. Well, everything is interesting here. So exploration. So here, I've mentioned this before. If we use naive exploration strategies in this game, we are essentially going to get nowhere. This thing will die all the time. So one way to handle this is to essentially come up with an intrinsic reward signal, intrinsic motivation, or curiosity can also be called. So here's some work from last year. It has been scaled, done a nice study on other environments, I think, recently as well. What it is that, so essentially what they do is they train a neural network that can predict the action that was taken for a transition to happen. So if you're doing that, so if you have a state and you have a next state, say the agent is moving in the world, you have these two things, and you have the action that took the agent from A to B. If you have these things, you can use them to predict the action. And when you do that, that actually means that you're learning a representation for the state that is somewhat relevant for acting. So you're trying to act. You're building a representation that helps act. So you're kind of learning a lot about action. And so you're learning features that are very helpful for acting. So this red box is essentially my way of saying that's the feature space you're working on now. So what one can do is you can use this. So they also build a model which takes in the current state and the action and predicts the next state in the same feature space. And now the difference between the predicted next state in the feature space and the actual next state in the feature space can be seen as a reward signal. Actually, there was another student who did something similar around the same time for his master's thesis. That's a very, very good master's thesis. You can have a look. His name is Mikkel Nyland. Yeah. So curiosity is how well you predict the next state in this feature space, and that rewards the agent. So if your predictions are bad, that means you want to explore that state space a bit more. If your predictions are good, you've been there before, no need to go there again. Yeah. Just a demo. I'll skip the demo because it's eating up some time. But this is a really, really cool idea. At least 2 people in the audience know what it is because they come to this meetup that runs every now and then. We do a RL meeting and we discussed that previously. So here, so as the name suggests, it's kind of that. So Bellman equation relates the value of the state and the next state through this Bellman equality, right? Current state's value is some reward plus discounted return from that point onwards. Similarly, instead of value, in addition to value, this paper shows you can also model the uncertainty in the same way. So this is the uncertainty for a state, the long-term uncertainty. How uncertain is this action? If I've been on many paths from this action onwards, that means I have low uncertainty. It's quite certain I shouldn't really go there. I've explored enough. But the key is that this is integrating this long-term uncertainty. So uncertainty of the state is some local measure of uncertainty plus discounted uncertainty from that point onwards. So it helps with propagating uncertainty across the state space in a similar way as values get propagated in the state space. And so you can use that uncertainty estimate to drive exploration. And this thing is a different kind of spread or uncertainty compared to the distributional RL setup. This is modeling the statistical uncertainty. The more samples you get from the environment, the smaller the uncertainty gets. So what do you do here? So again, DQN, it's a really simple modification to DQN. At least one person here has implemented it. So you get in state, you get Q values in simple DQN. But here you're also trying to get uncertainty values. And if you have these values, you can use the idea like Thompson sampling for exploration. So you have both. You can, in this case, since this is high uncertainty, although the Q value is lower, you can still explore more because maybe this is not the right distribution. Maybe the actual Q value lies here and it's higher than this purple one. So you can use these values to drive exploration in this regard. And this actually, this idea helps with Montezuma's Revenge, the notorious game, quite significantly. Also shows that we need more fundamental progress in RL. RL is not solved yet. I mean, the problem formulation can be worked on from different angles. Next is another line of work that is very interesting, which is hierarchical RL or temporal abstractions. So in this game again, instead of making this poor guy learn the entire big task, what if we could break the task down into sub-problems? What if we could provide this agent a reward when it reaches here? That would be a subtask. Then from here to the ladder would be another task. Here to here would be another task. So what if we could have this done in a hierarchical way? So one of the works looks at this hierarchical idea where these subtasks are predefined, and this is the higher level agent. The meta controller controls which tasks to select from between the tasks, and a lower level agent with high temporal resolution, it's selecting primitive actions. So essentially, the meta controller, for example here, chooses the goal, this one, key. The lower level controller doesn't get that, it dies, and it hands over control to the lower level controller, but the controller dies and hands over control back to the meta controller. The meta controller then selects another goal, ladder. The lower level controller achieves it, okay. So now here, and this kind of a process keeps going on. So this idea is quite powerful, but has a limitation, and that limitation is that the goals, high-level goals, are predefined. It would be nice if the high-level goals could be automatically discovered. So there comes another idea, which is from DeepMind. here there is another, again, a separation between a meta controller or a manager and a worker. And they call it feudal. It has some history. Jeff Hinton did some work back in the day which follows this idea, but not like this with deep neural networks. So here the manager is essentially trying to find directions. So this is nice to think of geometrically. So a direction in state space, what could it be? State space is a vector, right? This pixel values, vector. Flatten it, it's a vector. Now, we know that if we if we have the start state and if we have some other state, what is the vectorial direction in there, which is b minus a? That's the direction in that vector space. So essentially what the manager here is selecting is these directions, these kind of differences in a feature space that is not the actual pixel space but learned, which is exhibited here by a red thing. So this is the direction that the manager selects and the worker has to achieve it. And how does the worker know that? How is it rewarded? Well, the worker will do something. So it goes from one state to another state. Now it also has this vector that it went on. We can compute the cosine similarity between the manager's direction and the worker's direction. And if it is matching, there is reward. And so in so doing, this architecture allows to separate the concerns, split the task into subtasks. In fact, visualizations in the paper say or suggest that it actually, these are counts of the goals that were selected, and the highest counts are for very, very meaningful goals. So this one, the maximum here, is for reaching the key. It was selected more often than not. Okay, so the nearly last idea I want to talk about is generalization. So deep RL, or RL in general, is really done a lot of work to master tasks. We are really getting really good at using deep RL to master tasks. Single task, give a task, run an algorithm, it will master it. So this is not so satisfying. We actually want an agent that, given a new task, can quickly adapt to it or actually already work very well with it. How can we do that? There are many ways to think about this problem. One is meta-learning, which kind of is an idea so you know, in supervised learning, we have this ImageNet data set which people have been using quite a lot. What it allows us to do is get some features which are very useful for tasks, further tasks. Not decision making per se, but say classifying something else. You just have to fine tune the network on a new task. So are there such kind of good features for decision making? So this is what meta-learning is, or learning to learn idea is looking at. So far, if you want to train a RL agent, you give it a task, learn to go east here, and it will keep going, running episode after episode after episode, and gets reward only for doing this, and eventually it learns. But in learning to learn is a slightly different idea. You basically change the loss function a bit to, instead of getting a good policy for this task, whatever task given, you have a series of tasks, and what you want is to minimize the gradient steps that you would take to get a good policy in all those tasks. That's one way to think about the math there. So the loss is essentially a sum of losses of the steps, change in grade, the updates that you would make for the task. It's a sum of those steps that you would need to learn a task across all tasks. Yeah, anyway. And you minimize that and you get a policy that essentially, given a new task, oops, that is new. So here it's given a, okay, yeah. It's too quick actually, but 0 is, it's given a new task, there's been no updates. One gradient step is, okay, it's given a new task and it has some data from this new task and can use to update its current policy. And that shows that in one step it is able to do the task fairly okay. Yeah. So, one more idea in this generalization thing is related to the multitask learning I mentioned when I was talking about how A3C and bashed A2C were scaled. And that is a combination of Impala, that high throughput training scheme, with another method, pop art. So what is happening here? So here you're giving this agent, training it using Impala, which can learn on many, many tasks simultaneously. One agent learning to solve many tasks simultaneously. But what happens is that some of the environments have higher rewards and more dense rewards than others. And so that changes the learning dynamics, and the agent starts learning more from these tasks at the expense of the others. So to prevent that from happening, this pop art idea basically normalizes the returns within each game to a certain scale, so that all scales are equal across all tasks. They are the same scale. And so the training updates, gradient updates that you get from each task would be the same scale. And so that means that you would value all the tasks better than the distribution that you were going for here. So you would learn from all the tasks better instead of focusing on a few. So that's just some demo for, this is the usual setup. This is not multitask learning. This is a pop art idea with a same game, MS Pac-Man. The rewards are clipped as usual in DQN, and here it learns this policy. But if you use normalization that is provided by pop art, it actually shows better behavior. It goes after the ghosts, which it wasn't doing in this case. And it learns more, and it shows better performance on multitask learning as well. Okay, here's one more. I will skip through this one. But I'll mention one last thing, actually. So, so how many here have read some of the AlphaGo stuff, or implemented some of the machinery maybe as well? Yeah, so that's good. So I don't have to dwell on this a lot. So you know about this work coming out of DeepMind again. Where else? So AlphaZero, which lands on chess, shogi, Go, and gets top performance on all these games, essentially is a very, very simple algorithm. It is learning from self-play reinforcement learning, where this is one agent. This is just the same agent. It is interacting with itself, acting, getting some observations, and then thinking a bit, and acting again, so on. So essentially what it is what I'm trying to say is it's a really simple setup. And that setup is, here's an agent. It plays one game. This is one game to the end against itself. For every move, it does a little bit of thinking through Monte Carlo research, which is essentially a guided search through this tree that it builds. For each action, it stores a value, and for each move, it stores some kind of probability of taking that move, and so on. It builds this tree for all these paths that you can take. And it uses a value function to actually guide this search. And after searching through the space, every time it takes a path, it updates this tree. That updated tree results in some policy. And that policy decides the move. So this is a lot of simulations happening in the background for every move. And it does that for every move and chooses an action from this policy. And that policy that spits out in every move is stored. The actions are stored. At the end, there's a result of the game. It could be win, loss, or draw. That is stored. And these things can be used to improve this value and policy network, which is itself being used to search the tree. In a way, it's a very simple algorithm, and it works on many, many games. Well, in this case, 3 games. And it's in a few days. I don't remember how many days it took for each of these games. Maybe hours, actually. It reaches superhuman performance. Maybe someone knows in the audience. But the key thing is that it's a simple algorithm that is so general that it works across these games. So simplicity, in some senses, is breeding this generality. So it's just a message which I actually like, and I heard this first from David Silver last year at NIPS. He was giving a talk on this, and I agree to this idea that if you think of a new algorithm, if it's simple, it's more likely that it is general. And so if you are working in this space, think about that. So that's it. That's all I had to say. I hope you're inspired to study reinforcement learning after all that. Thank you.